give me this opportunity to participate in this very important seminar that's trying to promote an important social reform agenda in Chile. My task over the next few minutes will be to provide a pretty broad context. I'm not going to talk about social policy, but I do want to talk about the experience coming from OECD countries, and certainly some OECD countries, that relates to, that provides a broad backdrop in how policies get made, and the role of monitoring and evaluation within that. I'm going to tackle three themes. I'm going to talk about the policy system, how public policies get made. Can we generalize about that in OECD countries? I'm then going to talk about a particular problem of policy making, and that is how you coordinate lots of different policies, how you coordinate, how the centre of government gets the different parts of government to act, and how the different parts of government act horizontally with each other. My third theme will be to talk about the specific role of monitoring and evaluation in OECD countries. And the story I will sketch out is that monitoring is very well embedded in OECD practice, but evaluation is less certainly well embedded. And then finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the implications of what one finds in the OECD countries for Latin America. But before I get on to my first theme, I just want to say why I think this broad background is relevant for social programs in Chile. There's an expression they use in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain. They talk about wicked problems. I don't know the Americans don't use that term, but wicked problems are problems that are complex and difficult to solve. And social problems can be the archetype of wicked problems. They're not the only area. There's things like environmental problems, which are difficult to solve. But social problems are very interconnected. When you have wicked problems, you need the different parts of government to work well together. So this is one particular reason why I wanted to insist a little bit on how OECD countries coordinate. My second point about relevance is that there's a very strong finding in my view that both coordination and evaluation are driven by effective demand for good performance. You don't see coordination of policies or evaluation of policies in a vacuum. You see that when there's a real strategic drive. Little bit about history. In the OECD countries, there was a new form of public management that became very fashionable, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon countries in the 1980s, but eventually spreading to all the OECD countries, called New Public Management. New Public Management did several things. It tried to remove activities from the centre of government. It tried to empower citizens. But what perhaps most concerns us here today is that it tried to instill better management practices in imitation of the private sector through things like making agencies more specialised, through introducing contracting as a kind of key concept in making the system work, and so forth. Now, by the 1990s, it was evident that this new paradigm was running into problems. Government has got huge in OECD countries and complex. In addition, the unintended consequences of this new public management introduced in the 1980s was that actually government became less coherent. Policies were more difficult to implement from the centre. And so these well-intentioned management policies started unravelling governments. That happened more in some countries than others, more in the Anglo-Saxon countries where reform was rapid. And just as a last word, monitoring and evaluation activities in the last few decades have essentially been servants of the dominant paradigm. So they were servants of a planning view of the world in the 1960s and 70s, and they were servants of new public management from the 1980s. So the first of my three themes before I come on to my conclusions is about policy making and how policies get made. I will skip over how I define a policy and a program. I should say that I was part of a team that produced a paper for the World Bank on policy making, and so that is something that can be referred to if people want the details. When I talk about a policy cycle, I'm talking about the whole cycle of activities that go from identification to the design of policies and the implementation of policies, and then the feedback, what you learn to make policies better. Now, I should immediately add that a policy cycle is a somewhat abstract idea because the reality is much more messy. Politics, as is only correct, plays a huge role in policy decisions, and politics, because of the way it works, which is not very neat, means that this policy cycle it's perhaps an ideal, but it's certainly somewhat abstract as an idea. Nonetheless, enough of it exists that it should be taken seriously. And in this little figure, I try to list how policy making proceeds through identification, through decisions, through implementation, and then through evaluation, and the evaluation then feeds back into better policies. That's the theory, and in part that's the practice, but not wholly. What we have in OECD countries is a half system for policy making, with many aspects that are not completely routinized. It's not a machine. It's the most machine-like part of it is the budget system, which has very clear processes that are observed. This is not true of policy making in general. There's a very important break in policy making between the world of politicians who dominate the actual identification and to some extent the design of policies, and the world of civil servants and technicians who dominate the implementation of those policies through programs. And that break is managed through an interface between those politicians and the bureaucracy. For instance, senior civil servants who are both technically qualified and politically appointed. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk about 4 different arenas where policy gets made. And I'll start with government at the centre. And the column which is slightly coloured, politics at the centre towards the left of the picture, gives the typical kind of practices and institutions that run policy at the centre. The political executive and the legislature propose policies, the cabinet and the legislature decide, often with public consultation and so on. And then there are management information systems that many governments have increasingly to see whether the intentions are whether policies are being implemented as intended. Then in the next column, we have technical support essentially for the column to the left. So technical support at the centre supports political decision making at the centre. And every OECD country has specialised offices attached to the centre of government. It may be called a cabinet office, it may be called a prime minister's office, it may be called a presidential office. Specialised offices which support the political executive. Some countries have specialised research bodies. Many countries simply commission ad hoc studies from the centre. And in all countries, there's a degree of technical support from the centre to the ministries. Also at the centre in some countries, there is quite a lot of performance audit and evaluation. Our third separate area of policy making is the budget system, the whole budget cycle. And in the interest of moving on, I'll come back to that. But it's obviously connected to political policy making, but it's the most formalised and well-behaved part of the system. And finally, and not to be underestimated, the ministries. I think we often fail to emphasise sufficiently that in many, many aspects it's the ministries that make policies, especially in their detail, not the centre. So how good the policies are is also hugely dependent on how good the ministries are. There are other elements not shown in the table we've just been looking at. Parliaments and congresses have various bodies to support their capacity to make and advise on policies, and there's a wealth of external institutions for auditing and evaluating, the so-called supreme audit institutions. These, I think, are probably the most important features of what's been developing in policy-making systems in OECD countries recently. Firstly, and very important, there's been more and more policy advice coming from outside government. Policy advice that's commissioned or policy advice that is given freely by political parties, by universities, by civil society. Second, performance management. Performance management is essentially a strategic planning approach to management, where you set your objectives, you implement them, you monitor them, and you learn from your mistakes and do better next time. And the instruments of that we see are very important in OECD countries. Internal contracting, and that's not legal contracting, it's what we call relational contracting. It's contracting that can't be legally enforced, but it's nonetheless important. We see a lot of monitoring as well. Next, as part of the budget cycle, almost all OECD countries are developing spending reviews. These essentially are reviews across sectors of whether budget spending is giving value for money. This is part of the budget cycle. And it's not clear yet how strongly that is having an impact on budget appropriations, but it is beginning to bite. And finally, external performance audit, which didn't used to exist. External audit used to be audit of compliance. In many countries, audit of performance is becoming more important. To simplify, I think it's useful to see three different types of models of policy making in the OECD. There's a US presidential model in which both President and Congress make policy. And the President, in order to, has a subordinate cabinet rather than a strong cabinet, has his own large, I might say, secretariat that helps him make policy and counterbalances the real strengths of Congress in terms of capacity for policy making. Next is the Westminster system, the English-speaking countries of the British Commonwealth. In this system, the cabinet and the secretariat of the cabinet are at the core of policy making. Parliament is subordinate. And there are variations among those countries depending on their voting systems, which make policy change, policy reform, slower or faster. Finally, we have the European systems, which are either parliamentary or semi-presidential, in France notably. In these systems, cabinets are subordinate, and political and legal constraints make policy change difficult, and more difficult than in the Westminster countries. There are some notable examples of good practice that are worth looking at in OECD countries. These include specialised policy analysis bodies in Britain, France, the United States, specialised policy analysis bodies in the US legislature, a new policy evaluation institution, AIVAL in Spain, and so on. On to my second theme, policy coordination. Policy coordination has suddenly become, in the OECD, I should almost say, the flavour of the month. It's something that we weren't hearing much about, let's say, 10 years ago, but it's become very important now. I've already discussed why it's important, so I won't go over that again. And I think it's useful to think of three elements to good coordination. One of them is the centre of the government that is able to strategically control the rest of the government. It knows what it's clear about its objective, and it has clear lines of control over other parts of government. Next comes mechanisms for actually making the various subordinate parts of the government, the various ministries and agencies, work with each other. And finally, to emphasise again a point I made earlier, you have to have good ministries in order to have good coordination. Now, I think this new wave of reform zeal in the OECD is somewhat at the level of rhetoric. They talk about post-new public management, joined-up government or whole-of-government reforms. And what we're seeing are proposals and experiments as much as we've actually seen clever solutions to the problem of coordination. I've mentioned that I just want to mention a few of the instruments for the centre. Oh, well, we'll leave that. For the centre to control the various parts of government. I've mentioned strategic planning, performance contracts, and another item we're seeing more frequently is developing a system of sanctions and reward of ministry officials to ensure that they do what the centre of government wants. Another interesting technique is delivery units, which we have in several countries. And these are units that, at the centre of government, that work with ministries on key problems that are a priority of the government, to make those government priorities actually work in practice. There are examples of that in the UK and certain countries outside the OECD, including Malaysia and Brazil. Finally, harmonisation of information systems is important for centralised control. In order to make horizontal coordination work better, what we've seen in some countries is a process of putting back together some agencies that were separated by reforms, let's say 10 or 20 years ago. We see various types of matrix arrangements to try and make ministries and agencies work together. This could mean a lead ministry, it could mean an interministerial task force, or in the States we have announced strategies, national strategies, which are the priority of the president. And the states also appoint so-called SARs, which are kind of something like super ministers in order to coordinate. Another interesting pattern we are seeing is an increasing amount of budget allocation to tasks and programs that cut across ministries. We're also seeing all sorts of experiments in new forms of delivery, experiments that try to make different public agencies work together and try to make them work with private agencies as well. Just to mention quickly some of the experiments. I've already I've made mention of most of these. One very interesting one is the introduction of cross-departmental budgeting in the United States in 2010. Coming on quickly to monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation it's difficult to call it a system in most OECD countries. Often monitoring and evaluation activities are separate from each other. In the UK, for instance, it's rare they're unified. Canada's an example. They overlap with other systems that governments have, like information systems, quality management. And evaluation itself overlaps with a lot of other analytical work that governments do in the area of policy assessment. There's a huge variety of how governments do monitoring and evaluation, particularly evaluation, and there's no standard best practice. This particular slide, which I will move over very quickly, tries to indicate that there's a great variety of objectives in monitoring and evaluation, and the importance of that is that depending on your objective, what you do to monitor and evaluate is different. Monitoring, it seems, is what has become most systemic in OECD countries. And it's become systemic because you can't have a performance management system, you can't have strategic planning without information about how well you're doing. So this is what is driving monitoring. Evaluation it's far less clear. It's far less clear that there's standard practice and certainly not best practice. Evaluation is quite a heterogeneous area. What is quite clear is that monitoring and evaluation, where they exist, and monitoring, as I say, is very widespread, are driven mostly by a performance management framework. In some countries, they're driven by external requirements, like particularly the European Union, but the largest one is performance management. Interestingly and ironically, we actually don't know how well monitoring and evaluation are doing. It's just, we're not measuring the measurement, and it's a frequent criticism. The general impression one gets from knowing the area from the literature is that monitoring is effective and spending reviews are effective, but there are question marks about how well evaluation works and how it works.
Geoffrey,
yeah.
Sorry, 5 minutes left.
5 minutes, that's fine. I'm now coming on to my final comments. In this table, I contrast the three systems of policy making that I presented earlier with with my understanding of the Latin American system, and I'm trying to kind of suggest that each system works through strong and weak points, but you'll see there are more weaks than strongs in Latin America, and I want to explain that a bit. Latin America, it seems to me, even if OECD is not necessarily a model, and we shouldn't think of it as a model, when I look at the performance of some Latin American countries, including Chile, in fiscal terms, and I look at the recent performance of the OECD countries, I just wonder whether OECD should be a model for anything, but bear that in mind. But it does seem, when you look at the policy cycle, there are very pronounced weaknesses, if one can generalize, about Latin America. And essentially the problem is that the policy-making function is dispersed. It's not the coordination of policy and the big strategy picture is not very well concentrated in the centre of government. You have presidential offices that are weak on technical issues. You have ministries of finance that are strong but have a fiscal bias. You have ministry of planning that may be technically strong but often lack political authority. And you have ministries that are often very weak, You have civil services that are often weak. So is there a European model that's more relevant? The bottom line, so as to speak, is that, in my view at least, Latin America stands somewhere between a US presidential model and a European model, and is furthest from the Westminster model. Finally, I just want to suggest, based on this line of analysis, some ideas that better policy should go in the direction of better policy making for Latin America. And I have, I think, 5 points. The first is that policy-making capacity at the centre of government needs to be strengthened. And I don't think that can be done through cabinets. Logically, it seems to me that presidential offices in Latin America should become more technically capable, and that raises the issue of the role of planning ministries should they move nearer to the president's office. Secondly, strategic government, for those governments that are sophisticated enough, strategic planning is very important. You should have objectives set at the top that cascade down to the objectives of the ministries and then cascade down to the objectives of the programs and so on. And they should be consistent, and that's strategic planning. You should have a system to monitor that, and there's an awful lot of advance that can be made. Once you have a demand for strategy, there's an awful lot of advance with modern techniques that can be made through monitoring. One also need to think very strongly about how government works together horizontally, because the problem is worse in Latin America. Information is hoarded in Latin American countries more than in OECD countries. Final 3 points. The ministries need strengthening. I often think we just simply don't go enough to analysing what the ministries do and don't do. There's a huge range of good and bad ministries, and the bad ministries should be made better. But it's difficult to make them better unless they have a strategic purpose. I think the technical capacity of legislators can be improved. That's been attempted for a number of years, and the United States provides a good model. Finally, anything that can be done that supports the generation of policy advice outside government, it seems to me, is a good thing, and it's one of the particular lessons that I think OECD practice can suggest for Latin America. Thank you very much.